Hello, this is Chris Browder. This is video 3.3 in this series on second language acquisition. Today we're going to be talking about age in second language acquisition. Most people believe children are very good at learning second languages and adults are not. This is a widely held belief. If this widely held belief is true, then age may be the most important factor influencing second language acquisition. In this video, we're going to talk about how age affects second language acquisition, and we're going to closely examine this idea, critically examine it. The main source for this video is Ellis's textbook, Understanding Second Language Acquisition, and Ortega's textbook by the same name. Let's begin by talking about age in first language learning because, well, second language acquisition theory borrows a lot from first language learning and builds on it. And, well, honestly, with children, it's kind of similar. One cannot begin to discuss the role of age in second language acquisition without considering the critical period hypothesis. The critical period hypothesis, or CPH, is the hypothesis that humans are somehow designed to learn languages at a certain period in their development, but lose this special ability as they get older. Biologists have discovered that other species have critical periods for their special abilities. Owls, for example, can visualize the space around them in the dark by listening to the sounds bouncing off the objects around them. This ability is similar to what bats do, but if an owl doesn't learn this skill early in life, it cannot learn it later. Biologists have discovered these special abilities in critical periods in many different species, and they were able to experiment with these animals, unfortunately, to really actually prove that these critical periods exist. So, if these critical periods exist for the animals' special abilities, then they probably exist for ours too, right? Logically, you'd say. There are examples of deaf children who could not learn spoken language because of their hearing impairment, but weren't given the opportunity to learn sign language until they were older. When those children tried to learn sign language later in life, they were never quite able to master it like the other deaf children who learned it at a young age. As you can imagine, researchers can't take children and do the children what they did to those owls. So they can't really prove this hypothesis is true or not. They can't really study it scientifically while being ethical. But sadly, there are actually examples of children who are not able to learn their first language because they were locked away from society by abused adults. When those children were rescued at a later age and adopted, they could never quite master their first language like native speakers. This child in this picture, for example, her name is Jeannie. Her parents tied her to a chair in a crib in a dark attic and kept her there until she was discovered by authorities at the age of 13. She was adopted, and they tried to teach her English as a first language, but she was never quite able to get the grammar, especially the syntax. She could get the vocabulary, but not the grammar. Linguist Noam Chomsky once speculated that children had some special kind of language acquisition device that was helping them learn languages so well. But he believed that adults lost access to this device somehow for some reason or another. Lenneberg speculated that the brains of children may actually be physically different from the brains of adults, and this might explain the critical period in the language acquisition device. And he found research to show that the brains were really changing in the way that they use language, processed language, learned language. As evidence of this, he showed that children who sustained damage to the right hemisphere of their brains lost their language use, while adults did not if the right hemisphere was damaged. But the opposite was also true. Adults who sustained damage to their left brains lost their language use, but the children did not. Moreover, children could recover from the language loss after the brain injury, but the adults generally could not. This seems to be strong evidence that the brains of children are indeed somehow functioning differently for languages than those of adults. But does the critical period hypothesis apply to second language acquisition as well as first language acquisition? Most people agree that it does to some degree, but the research is still unsure of how much it does and why it does. For this reason, some SLA researchers refer to a strong version of the CPH for second language acquisition theory and a weak version. As you can guess, the strong version claims age has a strong effect on SLA, while the weak version claims age has a weak effect. Some people also prefer to refer to childhood as a sensitive period for language acquisition instead of calling it a critical period. We're going to look at some evidence for both views, but I think you'll find that this issue of age and SLA is really not simple at all. Some research shows major differences in the level of attainment for L2 mastery for immigrant language learners who immigrated as young children compared to those who immigrate as adults. Children who immigrate at a younger age have higher levels of attainment than children immigrating at a later age, but it seems that once puberty hits, age seems to make little difference. It doesn't seem to matter much if the learner is 16 or 60. This research seems to support the CPH, but it is important to note that it does not show a direct correlation between age and language learning. It seems more likely that there is some sort of cut point, and that cut point again seems to be at a very young age, possibly before puberty. In fact, with some skills, it might be as early as age 4 or age 7. Not all research finds the same thing about age in second language learning. Some studies find that some adults seem to be learning second languages just fine. In fact, some researchers have even discovered adults who could attain very high levels of mastery in an L2 in a very short period of time. These learners appear to be evidence against the CPH, but it must be mentioned that these miraculous adult learners did not actually master native-like proficiency like many children do. Generally, their grammar or pronunciation never quite reaches native-like levels. It's always slightly different somehow. So I guess you could say, in conclusion, a look at all the research shows that some adults do achieve very high levels of L2 proficiency in a short time, but rarely ever achieve the levels of mastery that children do. So it's probably more accurate to say that adults are capable of learning second languages faster than children at first, and that children eventually catch up and pass them. It is common for immigrant children to master native-like proficiency in an L2, but in adults, it's extremely rare. To understand these differences between adults and children, we probably need to discuss some specific advantages and disadvantages for adults. Let's contrast children's first language learning with adults' second language learning for starters. As you may recall, children must spend the first year of their lives babbling before they can begin to make simple words even. This is because they must learn the phonemic system of the target language before they can start speaking. Adults, in contrast, don't have to wait even one day to start producing words in a second language. They can start trying to use the second language from day one. This is because adults already have a phonemic system from their first language and can usually apply it to start trying to utter words and phrases in a second language right away. This is a huge head start for adults, but might be slowing them down later on. Specifically, if they're using their L1 phonemic system to produce L2 words, then they may never develop native-like pronunciation. They could have an accent their entire life. They could continue using the L1 phonemic system when speaking in the L2, and they would sound like they have a heavy foreign accent. But is this really a problem? Can't native speakers simply learn to be more tolerant of people with foreign accents? The same goes for other aspects of L2 learning, such as syntax, morphology, pragmatics. The more developed your L1 is, the more of a head start you have when learning in L2. But adult learners must be very determined not to become satisfied where they are and plateau. For adults, motivation and persistence is very important. Children under the age of puberty may also have a developed L1 they can tap into just like adults, but they may also have certain other advantages related to being in the critical period. And the younger the child is, the greater those natural advantages are. But besides the L1, adults also have other resources they can tap into learning a second language faster. Adults can study and memorize vocabulary and grammar rules, and often appear to be able to use this explicit knowledge of the second language to scaffold their pronunciation and comprehension of the second language until they have practiced enough to internalize it. Research shows that a determined adult can tap into these cognitive advantages and learn much, much faster than any child for at least a year or two, especially if you're looking in terms of vocabulary learning. If you're just counting the number of words in the vocabulary, adults are much, much faster, especially if they're memorizing the vocabulary and getting practice. Eventually, however, adults almost always plateau before they reach native like proficiency, and children don't. Knowing about the critical period hypothesis might make many people conclude that we must start teaching children a second language as early as possible. These people would have us introduce language classes into kindergartens and preschools. When faced with this issue of educational policy, it is important to clarify, however, that children are not necessarily better suited for learning second languages in formal classroom instruction than adults are. Clearly, immigrant children in full-time language immersion attain higher levels of L2 proficiency than adults do. But learning a language while living in a country is very different from learning a language while taking language classes. If you're not even living in the country, and you're just studying 30 minutes a day, it's a big difference between living in the country and full immersion. A determined adult can learn a lot in a foreign language classroom, even if it is only 30 minutes a week. Children, on the other hand, may need something much more significant than that in order to make any impact at all. There is no evidence that introducing a foreign language to children with a 30-minute per week instructional program will result in any real language proficiency worth having. To tap into children's talent for language learning, the children must get something more akin to a developmentally appropriate, full-time, two-way bilingual immersion program like, what they have in Canada. The key to understand here is that children are learning languages implicitly. Adults are generally using explicit learning strategies. That's adults' advantage. That gives them a head start. Implicit learning requires massive exposure to the language, and that's what they can get in a bilingual immersion program, any kind of full immersion with some sort of support. They're going to get that exposure. But I do need to clarify, even then, they're still not really going to master the language in a week or two like some people think. The research shows that in order to master that higher level of language proficiency that children need to be successful in school, we're talking about CALP, remember, cognitive academic language proficiency. Children need 5 to 7 years in order to reach that level. Don't let them fool you. Within a very short period of time, they're going to seem to have perfect pronunciation, but that perfect pronunciation does not equal mastery in a second language. There's more to language than just pronunciation. Well, I'd like to close by coming to the defense of adult language learners again and again and again. As we discussed, children need something more like a full-time two-way bilingual immersion program to successfully learn a second language. But now think about that for a while. If we gave adults the same opportunity, wouldn't they also thrive? Is it possible that one of the most important differences between adults and children is simply their learning environment? Think about it. Immigrant children come to a new country and are generally immersed in the target language in school for 7 hours or more every day. This immersion experience is hopefully supported by some other support, such as EASL classes. How well would you learn a language if you could be immersed in it 7 hours or more each day? Especially think about this if you didn't have to go to work or cook dinner for your children or any of those things. If all you had to do was worry about learning a language just full time, all day, all night for years, yeah, I think you'd probably do fine. Think about this too. Children also experience much more social integration with native speakers than adults do. If adults could have more friendships with native speakers, wouldn't they also learn faster? Aren't most adult immigrants kind of isolated often? Finally, there's this issue of prejudice, expectations, standards, demands. The language demands placed on children, especially very young children, are usually very low. Uh, In other words, the standards they must meet are much easier to attain than that of adults. So think about a child going to preschool or kindergarten. The teacher is teaching. When the teacher is teaching those kids about shapes like triangles, squares, circles, she's showing them the triangles, squares, and circles. All the children in that room are learning the same vocabulary. Doesn't matter whether they use English as a first language or a second language, they're all learning the same vocabulary, and they're learning it with incredible scaffolding to make the input comprehensible. It's extremely accessible because it's very concrete. And that's a great way to learn a language, not just for children, but for adults too. If a child acquires just a little bit of Bix, then everybody goes, "Ooh, ah, wow! This child learns languages so quickly, right?" Yeah, and a lot of that is because of pronunciation. We hear the child speak, the child has good pronunciation. We say, "Wow, the child's a genius. The child's done learning English." That's not fair. In contrast, the language needs of adults can be very, very intense. Think about what high school students have to do. Many adults find that native speakers are often unreceptive or even hostile to non native speakers, and that just makes it so much worse. Some people have very little patience for people with foreign accents. So that's a huge disadvantage for adults. So I guess let's close here. Maybe what adult language learners really need is just a little respect. I hope this presentation was helpful for you and maybe even enjoyable. Thanks a lot.